The strange part is that many dogs begin responding slower the more we repeat the command, not faster, slower. A person says sit once, the dog looks up immediately, ears forward, attention there for a second, then the command comes again sit, sit, sit. And something subtle starts changing. The dog still hears the voice. You can often see that clearly. Maybe there's a small pause first, a glance upward, a slight delay before moving. Sometimes the dog even looks calm, almost like he's waiting for something else to happen before responding. And that's usually the moment people start thinking, why is he suddenly ignoring me? Especially when the dog already knows the cue well, because from the human side, it can feel confusing. You repeat the command more clearly, more firmly, sometimes louder, but the response becomes slower instead of faster. You may have seen moments like this with your own dog without thinking much about them. And in many cases, the change does not happen all at once. It builds quietly through repetition, not because the dog stopped learning, or maybe more accurately, because the dog may be learning something different than we intended. What many people notice first is not the dog refusing the command, it's the delay. At the beginning, the dog may respond after the second cue, then after the third, and after a while, some dogs seem to wait for a completely different version of the command altogether. A louder voice, a sharper tone, a hand movement, the owner leaning forward slightly. That pattern can develop very quietly because the dog still responds eventually. So, from the human side, it may not seem important at first, but if you watch closely, there are often small changes happening before the delay becomes obvious. A short pause before sitting, the dog looking at the owner instead of responding immediately. A brief moment of stillness, almost as if the dog is checking whether more information is coming. Sometimes the ears shift first. Sometimes the body stays still for half a second longer than usual. Small things. And that matters more than it may seem, because many dogs are not simply reacting to the word itself. In many cases, they're also learning the pattern around the word, the timing, the repetition, the emotional rhythm of the interaction. You may have seen small moments like this with your own dog without thinking much about them, especially in everyday situations where commands become part of the background of the house. Dogs learn patterns much faster than many people realize, especially young dogs. And in some cases, the pattern they learn is not actually the command, it's everything around the command. A puppy hears sit once. Nothing happens yet. Then the word comes again. Maybe the owner's voice becomes firmer the second time. Maybe the body leans forward slightly. Maybe there's a hand motion now. And after enough repetition, some dogs begin treating those later signals as the part that really matters, not intentionally, just through repetition and timing. So the dog may stop responding to the first cue right away because the first cue no longer feels complete. That's why some owners start saying things like, he listens, but only when I really mean it. And that phrasing is interesting because for many dogs, really mean it often comes with a predictable change in tone, posture, distance, or repetition, not just a word. You can sometimes see this happen in very small ways. The dog hears the first cue and stays still for a moment, not disconnected, not distracted, watching, almost waiting to see whether the familiar second version is coming. A louder voice, a repeated word, a step closer. And this is where the situation starts to look a little different because the dog may not be resisting the communication. In many cases, the dog is adapting to the communication pattern we repeat most often. What often changes next is the atmosphere around the cue itself. A person repeats the command again, trying to make it clearer. Come, come, come. But after enough repetition, the word can slowly stop standing out, especially in ordinary moments where conversation, movement, and routine are already happening around the dog. The kitchen before dinner, the hallway near the leash, a quick sit while reaching for the food bowl. The cue is still there. But sometimes it starts blending into everything surrounding it, and many owners naturally respond by adding more intensity. The voice becomes quicker, a little sharper. The body moves forward before the dog has even reacted to the first cue, usually not out of frustration. More often, it's just an attempt to reconnect the dog's attention to the moment. But for some dogs, that extra pressure creates hesitation instead of clarity. You can sometimes see it in very small reactions first, a pause halfway toward the owner, a brief stillness before sitting. the dog glancing upward for a moment, almost checking what version of the interaction is coming next. And that changes the situation more than people realize because the dog is often still trying to cooperate. The interaction has simply become crowded with extra signals surrounding the original cue. At this point, the pattern starts becoming easier to recognize. Because the delay is usually no longer random, the dog responds after the second cue or the third, or after the owner steps closer and repeats the word with more pressure in the voice. And interestingly, some behavior researchers have observed something very similar in everyday dog owner interactions. A study published in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior looked at how human timing affects already learned behaviors in dogs. Researchers noticed that when timing became less consistent, dogs often responded more slowly, and owners, almost naturally, began repeating commands more often. That connection matters here, because after enough repetition, some dogs may begin learning that the first cue is not the moment action usually happens. The meaningful part comes later, after the second sit, or the sharper tone, or the movement toward them. Not because the dog is trying to be difficult. In many cases, the dog is simply adapting to the communication pattern that happens most consistently. And once you start looking at the interaction that way, the behavior can feel a little less frustrating and a little more understandable. And once that pattern repeats enough times, many owners begin changing their behavior without even noticing it. The command comes faster now. Sit, sit, sit. The body leans forward sooner. The hand starts pointing before the dog has even had time to respond. The tone tightens slightly around the second or third cue. And from the human side, that reaction feels completely reasonable because it looks like the dog stopped listening. But for many dogs, the situation has already shifted into something more specific. The dog is no longer reacting only to the original word. He's reacting to the full sequence that usually follows it. The repeated cue, the sharper tone, the movement toward him, the extra pressure surrounding the moment. You can sometimes notice it very clearly if you watch the timing instead of the command itself. The first sit happens, and the dog pauses, not distracted, not wandering away, just watching for a second longer than before. Almost as if experience has taught him that the important version usually comes after the first one. That's the part many people never realize they've been teaching, because from the outside, it can look like stubbornness. But in many homes, the dog may simply be adapting to the interaction pattern that happens most consistently every day. And over time, the escalation itself becomes predictable. So eventually, some dogs stop responding to the first cue altogether. Not because they stopped understanding it, but because they learned that the real moment to respond usually arrives a second later. And in many cases, the shift back toward better listening starts with something very small, less repetition, not silence in a dramatic sense, just a little more space after the cue. For a lot of dogs, that brief pause changes the feeling of the interaction almost immediately. The command sounds clearer again, more complete. There's no second sit arriving half a second later, no rising pressure around the moment, no rush to fill the silence before the dog has even had time to process the first cue. And you can sometimes see the difference in the dog right away. The body softens slightly, the hesitation becomes shorter, attention stays on the owner instead of drifting toward the tension surrounding the command. What matters here is not being passive. And it's not about letting the dog win something. Dogs often respond more comfortably when the interaction feels calm and predictable. One cue, a steady tone, a moment to think before anything else happens. And for many dogs, that alone changes more than people expect, because once the extra pressure disappears, the original cue becomes easier to notice again. By this point, the behavior usually starts looking very different than it did at the beginning of the interaction. The dog was not necessarily learning to ignore the owner. More often, the dog was learning which part of the interaction consistently carried the clearest meaning: the repeated cue, the shift in tone, the movement that always came right before the response was expected. And once people notice that pattern, a lot of everyday moments suddenly become easier to understand. The dog who pauses near the doorway before coming over, the brief hesitation before lying down, that quick glance upward before sitting, almost checking whether another signal is about to follow. These moments are easy to interpret as stubbornness or selective listening, but often they're simply part of a rhythm that developed gradually over hundreds of ordinary interactions. Not because anyone planned it that way, just because people naturally repeat themselves when they want attention quickly. Dogs adapt to those routines surprisingly fast, especially inside the same daily environments where the same words and reactions happen again and again. And for many dogs, listening becomes easier once the interaction itself becomes simpler, not stricter, not more forceful, just clearer, fewer extra signals surrounding the cue. Less emotional pressure around the response, more consistency from one moment to the next. Sometimes that quiet shift changes the entire atmosphere between the dog and the person speaking to him. So, in the end, this often turns out to be less about control and more about clarity between the dog and the person speaking to him. Because dogs pay attention to much more than words alone. They notice pauses, timing, body movement, small changes in tone that happen before people even realize they're there. And over time, many dogs begin responding to the entire pattern surrounding a cue, not just the cue itself. That's why these changes inside the home can happen so quietly. A dog pauses before sitting, waits near the kitchen doorway before coming over, looks up for a second, almost checking whether another version of the cue is still coming. And once people begin noticing those small moments differently, the interaction itself often starts changing too, not through louder correction, not through stricter control, usually through calmer, clearer timing. One cue, a little less urgency around it, a little more consistency from one moment to the next. And for many dogs, that creates something much easier to trust and understand because sometimes the problem was never that the dog stopped listening. The interaction had simply become too crowded for the original cue to stand out clearly anymore.